And they will soon be in this period of rapid aging, where it's the older population that's increasing more rapidly and presenting more and more of a dependency challenge.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Every 2 years, since 1951, the United Nations has compiled data and estimates about the world's population. These are contained in a report called World Population Prospects, which is our best estimates about global population and demographic trends. The latest edition of World Population Prospects was released in June, and joining me today is one of the people responsible for putting this report together. John Wilmoth is director of the Population Division at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. He last joined us 2 years ago after the previous iteration of this report was released. We discuss what changed or not from the estimates of 2 years ago, why we should be paying attention to rapidly aging populations in East Asia, and what we mean by the demographic dividend that many countries in Africa are poised to harness. I find these kinds of grand demographic discussions totally fascinating. I think you will too, and I look forward to having John Wilmoth back on the show in 2 years' time to discuss the report once again. Now here is John Wilmoth, Director of the Population Division at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So, John, before we discuss the 2024 findings, can you just explain to listeners what the World Population Prospects Report is and how you go about gathering the data that feeds into it?
It summarizes the global population trends. We work with 237 units of analysis. Most of those are countries, some are territories, belong to certain countries around the world, but altogether those 237 units make up the total population of the world. And the World Population Prospects data set is a complete statistical description of the global population. That's to say, it provides information on the population of each of those countries or areas by age and sex. So complete population broken down by age and sex, and estimates for the past going back to 1950, from 1950 to the present, and projections going from the present out to 2100. And then in addition to the population estimates and projections, that's the numbers by age and sex, the counts, the data set also includes levels and trends in mortality, fertility, and international migration, because those are the components of population change. So all of that information is together. It's a huge quantity of data because it's not only for each of the individual countries, but also for multiple aggregates, combinations of countries, groupings of countries according to various criteria.
So it really is the most comprehensive data we have on global trends around population. Like, it's the source.
It's usually considered the authoritative source for this kind of information. That's true. And this has been going on since, I believe, 1951 was the first year that the UN produced this kind of information. And this is the 28th edition of the UN's estimates and projections of global population.
So I think the last time you and I spoke was 2 years ago, presumably the 27th edition. So I'm keen just to get an update from you about where things stand in our global population. So what are just some of the top line takeaways from the 2024 data and findings?
Well, one of the key points is that the global population is continuing to increase in size, currently around 8.2 billion people, and we expect that it will continue to grow until it reaches, in the 2080s, we expect that it could reach a maximum of around 10.3 billion. The growth continues today. On a global scale, the growth continues, but it is slowing down. And it has been slowing down gradually for the last 50 years. Global population growth reached a peak around 1970 when it was increasing by about 2% per year. That 2% rate of increase fell gradually. It dropped below 1% in recent years. We expect that it will hit zero by the 2080s and that the global population will stop growing. But that growth overall reflects a great diversity across countries. Some countries are still growing because they have birth rates that are relatively high. Women are still having 4 or 5 children over a lifetime on average in some countries, in particular countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But in other parts of the world, the fertility rate has fallen so low, it's fallen below what we call the replacement level, which is the number of births per woman that would be required to maintain the population, to have zero growth in the long run, just to maintain the current population. That's what we call replacement level fertility.
Was that like 2.1 children per woman? Is that right?
Births per woman, yeah, which may become children if they all survive, of course. But 2.1, which accounts for the sex difference at birth because you tend to get more boys than girls. And then there's some mortality, small degree of mortality. So that's to ensure that you have one surviving female from each female of reproductive age. And that ensures then that you have zero growth in the long run.
So your data suggests that in the 2080s, as you said, we'll hit zero population growth. That's when global population will peak at around 10.3 billion people, according to your estimates. What happens after the 2080s? Does population growth, is that expected to decline?
We don't know for sure. Of course, once you're looking at things out, 6 decades into the future, there's increasing uncertainty. We can be fairly confident about the projections over the next 30 or maybe 40 years. But beyond that, when you get out to something where you're 2 or 3 generations into the future, there's more and more uncertainty about what will happen. But our projections indicate that there could be a slight decline in the global population, but slowly. I mean, it might decrease from 10.3 to 10.2 billion by the end of the century, over a decade and a half, from the mid-2080s until 2100. So at that point, we don't really know that the global population could stabilize at a level slightly above 10 billion. It could remain in that range for a long time, or it could start to decline more rapidly, like it is in certain countries today, where what we see for some countries is a pattern of rather rapid decline, and we can anticipate a continuation of that decline in some of these countries.
Let's talk a little bit about that decline. I'm just sort of interested in getting from you just some examples at like a country or region level that tell part of this broader story. So I take it, for example, from your report that South Korea has a really declining birth rate and declining population. Why is that significant? Why is that the case, first of all, in the South Korean context? And why is that globally significant? And what kind of story does that tell? So
Korea is a particular case that's great interest. The fertility level has been quite low in recent years. I believe it's around 0.75, 0.7, 0.8 births per woman at this point in Korea. That's the Republic of Korea, or South Korea. I believe that's the lowest fertility rate that we're observing now anywhere in the world. And therefore, the population will start to decline very soon. In fact, it's really just at the point where it's starting to decline. And we expect that its current population of just over 50 million could decrease by 2050 to around 45 million. And by the end of the century, it could be as low as around 22 million people. So it could be less than half of its current size. And we're observing that in some countries, in particular in East Asia, that if you look at the implications of current trends and you run them out through the century, we're seeing that for the Republic of Korea, but also for Japan and even China, that the projections indicate that the population could be cut in half over the rest of the century.
Wow. I mean, What are some of like the broader like public policy implications of having a population size over the course of, a generation or two generations, I suppose, like 60, 50, 60 years? I mean, presumably, it means that you need younger workers somehow to support the social safety net of the aging population, which I suppose probably means you need migration. Could you just sketch that out for me?
Of course, you have a much larger older population. You also have a smaller population of children and youth. And so, in some sense, the total dependency doesn't change as much as you might think. It just shifts from younger to older ages.
Hmm.
However, older persons tend to consume more than younger people. They tend to live independently and have their own households. And so it's more costly to support a large older population than to support a large younger population. But there are many ways to adjust. For example, what matters is how big is the workforce relative to those who are not in the workforce. And, we have this idea that everybody retires at 65 in some countries, but that doesn't have to be the case. And many people desire to continue working after that age. And so, we don't need to stick with all of our current habits. And if we make adjustments in the way that we live our lives and interact with each other, I think these changes in the age structure of populations can be accommodated if we make various adjustments in the way that we live. That being said, a decrease of this magnitude and taking place at that speed is going to be very challenging. In general, our perspective is that societies can adapt to population change if it's fairly slow. A growth rate of under 1%, for example, is easier to manage than a growth rate of 2% and above. It really makes quite a difference, the speed of change. And so rapid growth is very challenging, and rapid decline is probably going to be challenging too. But we've never really been in this situation. We've never seen this before. So there's a lot of speculation about what it means.
So, on the flip side of the equation, where are you seeing the fastest growth today? And what does that portend for the future?
The fastest growth is among the least developed countries, most of which are located in sub-Saharan Africa. And in those countries, we're expecting, the opposite of what I was telling you before. We're expecting a doubling of the populations even by 2050. So the rapid growth continues, and that presents various challenges. These are often countries that, they're disadvantaged in various ways. There's a lack of resources. There's a political system that may be corrupt or just not so efficient in delivering the services that the population needs. Then you add this very rapid growth and the challenges of rapid growth on top of it. I like to give the example of educating children and youth. I think, the ideal situation in a country that's less developed is that they need to improve the quality of the education that each child receives. But when there is every year an additional number of children, if the number keeps growing year by year, then any additional resources that you can generate end up being spent on increasing the number of children in the system rather than improving the quality. So rather than having more and more students, we'd like to have the same number or a smaller number better educated. And so it's just a competition for resources in some sense that makes it challenging to have this continuing rapid growth.
And, there's this concept of the demographic dividend that I'd love to have you explain in the context of your findings, and also maybe identify for listeners what countries, what regions you think might be on the cusp of that demographic dividend.
Well, the demographic dividend is basically, as populations change over time, they change in terms of size, and they also change in terms of age structure. And the general tendency, of course, there's been this period of growth in human history. Depends on which part of the world you're talking about, but the population has increased and it's become older. And these are the two main consequences of what we call the demographic transition. Just to back up, the demographic transition is the movement towards longer lives and smaller families. This transition has been happening all over the world, and it's at different points in different parts of the world. Some parts of the world have completed that transition in the sense that life expectancy is now at historically high levels, and the fertility rate has fallen to a point that the countries are no longer growing, and some are even declining in size. So the demographic transition has swept across the world. All countries are going through it. Some are still in early or intermediate stages. Some have completed the transition. And there are two major consequences. One is rapid growth during the transition. So we end up at the end of the transition with a much larger population than we started with. And the other consequence is that the population becomes much older over the course of the transition. The age structure shifts towards older ages.
So that's the demographic transition. And then there's this concept of like the dividend that like pays off when you've made that transition.
So with this growth and then aging of the population, that has various implications. The shift in the age structure, it goes through various stages. The first thing that happens is that as the death rate starts to fall, most of the improvements in mortality are at younger ages. They affect children. In countries that when they first start to develop the health system, one of the first areas where there are gains is among children, that children are saved from many of the diseases of childhood, and you get more and more children. The population actually becomes younger at first. That's the situation that we're still kind of seeing in some countries in Africa, that they have very young populations. Well, it's because of the successes in controlling child mortality. But then the next stage of the demographic transition involves the reduction of fertility. And as countries bring the birth rate down, then you get fewer births every year, and the population starts shifting towards older ages. Initially, it shifts towards the working ages. You know, all of those big cohorts of children that are surviving more than they did in the past, they reach the working ages and the reproductive ages. So there's a period during this shift towards older populations in which the population becomes more and more concentrated in the working ages. And so you have a larger and larger working age population relative to the rest. And that's a period of potential economic gain, because if there's this increasing concentration of the population in the working age range, then it's possible to increase income per capita at a more rapid pace. And so the demographic dividend is all about this favorable period of time in which the working age population is growing more rapidly than the rest of the population, which presents some opportunities for rapid economic growth if taken advantage of.
Are there any specific countries that you could cite that are like in the midst of that?
Well, there are many that are coming toward the end of it. Many countries in Asia, for example, they've gone through that part of the transition where they've seen the increasing size of the working age population, and now they're starting to become older populations. So I was just recently in Malaysia, for example, and I looked at the data for that country, and they're coming toward the end of this period of the demographic dividend, the period when the working age population has been increasing in size, because now the population is moving towards older ages and they're getting more and more older persons, and the older population is starting to increase. And I think they have about 10 more years when they can benefit from this demographic dividend, which is the period when the working age population is increasing faster than the rest. And they will soon be in this period of rapid aging, where it's the older population that's increasing more rapidly and presenting more and more of a dependency challenge.
So Malaysia is transitioning out of this period. Is there any country in particular that's starting the period that might lead to the dividend?
It's the group of countries that are growing rapidly today, especially those in sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at the working age population of the world and where is the working age population going to be increasing in future years, it's largely in sub-Saharan Africa. That's where you see a large growth in the population in that age range. People have been referring to the youth bulge in Africa over recent years, and that youth bulge is moving into the working age range. And over the next several decades, we expect to see a continued growth in the working age population in Africa. And that's where there's really an enormous potential for economic growth as well.
So lastly, the last time you and I spoke was the last iteration of this report 2 years ago. Any particular changes or surprises between your findings 2 years ago and this year's report?
Well, I like to go back more than 2 years, because sometimes over 2 years, the changes are fairly small and incremental. That if you look over a longer period, it's more interesting. So if we could go back to the data that were released in 2013, for example, And that was the first edition where I was the director and was involved in the release. So I remember that very clearly. But it also marked a time when we started doing probabilistic assessments of the future projections. That's to say, we started assigning probability intervals around our central projections and making statements about what's the probability that the actual value will lie within that range. And we initially only considered the uncertainty around the trends in fertility because that's the biggest part of the future uncertainty. And then we gradually added more components. The component for mortality was added in 2015. And then for immigration, it was added in this last round. But nonetheless, the conclusion of the work of this probabilistic analysis back in 2013 was that we thought that the global population would probably not reach a peak in this century. We thought that it was more likely than not that the population would still be growing at the end of the century. It was possible that it would reach a peak within the 21st century, but more likely than not, it would occur after 2100. And in fact, we assigned a probability of only 30% that it would reach a peak before 2100 and 70% that the peak would come after that time. We've changed that conclusion.
Yeah, it's 2080s now.
Our best guess is that the global population will hit a peak in the 2080s, and the probability that we assign to it happening before 2100 is 80%. So it's gone from being 30% chance that the peak would be reached by 2100 to an 80% chance that it will be reached by 2100. Of course, there's uncertainty in both cases, but with the additional information that we've gained over the last 10 years, it has shifted our view of the slowdown in global population increase. It is increasing more slowly than had been expected, and that leads to this conclusion that it's more likely than not that we will have a peak in the global population size before the end of the century rather than after.
Well, look, I will be 100 years old in the early 2080s. I'll have you back on the show to confirm, and we'll see if your probability estimates are accurate. But really, seriously, I find this conversation endlessly fascinating. There's so much like rich data in your report. Thank you so much for putting it together and sharing your insights.
Well, you're very welcome, Mark. Thank you for the interview.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.